So first of all, I want to thank the Beacon team for inviting me to this webinar. Clinical trials is an area that's near and dear to my heart, and a very exciting area. So I'm hoping to give you an introduction to the work that we do in clinical trials and how a patient might interact in that context. And I'll also give you some information relative to where we are from a muscle-invasive bladder cancer perspective, as well as kind of teeing up some questions and answers that hopefully will address some of the concerns that you might have as a patient. All right, so I was diagnosed in October 2006. I had muscle-invasive bladder cancer, so the discussion we're having today is very relevant to me on a personal level, but obviously very relevant to many bladder cancer survivors on a personal level as well. So I had a radical cystectomy, and I have a neobladder. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the work that I do in the area of research advocacy. And then we'll talk about what research advocacy is in the clinical trial context. So we'll give you a little bit of a taste for the work that we do with folks like Dr. Singh and Dr. Black, and then we'll talk about what's new. Okay, so I already told you that I'm a bladder cancer survivor. I do work with some of the groups that you're seeing on the screen now. So I've done some work with the Beacon team, which does amazing things. Worked with them on an early version of what we used to call patient tips. Also worked on the clinical trials dashboard, and I've done some webinars and some other things. So I'm always thrilled when I have an opportunity to work with the Beacon team and the researchers that work with them. I do some work with SWOG, and SWOG is a group that is funded by the National Cancer Institute. Think of it as a virtual team that's working on your behalf to define the clinical trials that should be done for various cancers, bladder cancer being one of the groups. I do some work for the National Comprehensive Cancer Center. It is, Cancer Network. So the National Comprehensive Cancer Network is one of the groups, and there are several that will define the standard of care. So when we talk about, well, what treatment should a patient have in these specific situation, a group like the NCCN or the SUO or the AUA or ASCO, those are all groups that define that standard of care, and the insurance companies often pay close attention to what these groups define as the standard of care in terms of determining what they will compensate for or not. And then I also do some work for the National Cancer Institute, which is under the National Institutes of Health, both within the cancer care delivery space, but also with my peer group of patient advocates. We've got an amazing group of research advocates. So this is the clinical trial life cycle. I've really simplified it. So we walked through several examples of clinical trials. They would have all gone through a life cycle like this. So the first stage in the process is the planning stage. And so that's where we would try to define where we want to have our clinical trial, what particular space in a disease, and we would shape the concept. What drug are we using? Is there going to be a placebo? Those kind of things. So it's very early part of the process to get it to the point where we are actually ready to involve our first patient. So in the implement stage, we're defining the protocol. So that's things. That's kind of the very detailed cookbook of the clinical trial. There's paperwork. If anybody on the call has ever participated in a clinical trial or is thinking about participating, there is a requirement that as a patient you know exactly what you're getting into, and so we developed this form called an informed consent to ensure that that happens. And then there's other collateral material that we might provide. There might be a brochure, there might be a video. Those are all done in the implement stage, and then we're going to share the results with the community. So that would be with other researchers, but it also would include the patient community and advocacy groups like Beacon. So I think it's important for people to understand that this is not a quick process from start to finish. It's not unusual for trials to span 8 or 10 years, depending on what the goals are. We're trying to get the life cycle down to a smaller time frame, but it does take a fair amount of time to get from the beginning to the end, and we do understand the urgency of doing so. All right, so let me stop here and talk about some things that are new in the muscle-invasive bladder cancer space. I've been doing research advocacy with SWOG since 2009, so I've seen some exciting things happen. And so the first noteworthy thing is that we have huge interest, incredible interest by pharmaceutical companies, and we've got new and approved drugs. When I started, we didn't have the same enthusiasm from the pharmaceutical companies, and we had not seen any new treatments for close to 30 years at the time that I started at SWOG. And so it's really exciting to see this level of interest, and not just interest, but actual drugs that are available for us to use in our clinical trials. The second thing, which is related obviously, is that we have this concept of immunotherapy. In fact, bladder cancer is, interestingly enough, even though we haven't had a lot of new treatments, we were one of the early users of immunotherapy. If many of you may be familiar with BCG, that's actually an immunotherapy drug, but in the more recent years, we've had new immunotherapy drugs. You heard talk about several of them on this call, and they are driving some very interesting questions about immunotherapy, but also as we work through our immunotherapies, there'll be questions to answer in terms of when one should have immunotherapy versus some of the other kinds of treatments, whether it's the surgical treatment or the radiation treatment. So what's the right sequence and what's the right combination? And you saw some trials that were trying to address some of those questions on this call. And then there are also, this is particularly exciting for somebody who's had a cystectomy, but it's exciting to see some challenges to that gold standard of using a cystectomy. So those of us who've had a bladder removal, we know what that surgery is about. But in the long term, obviously, we'd like to ensure that patients retain their bladder. So you heard about an exciting new outcome called bladder intact disease-free survival. That's kind of a new concept that we're trying to test with some of our clinical trials, and it's exciting to see.
So Rick, I just wanted to interject because we've been talking so much about clinical trials. I just wanted to let everyone know that Beacon actually has a clinical trials dashboard. If you go to beacon.org, you can get there, or you can type in clinicaltrials.bcan.org, and you'll get to our clinical trials dashboard where you can actually search by your disease state of non-muscle invasive, muscle invasive, or advanced metastatic. And then also you can search by your geographic state. You can save trials. You can log in and then you can email them to people. If you want to send it to your doctor or to a loved one, you can certainly do that. But that's a great one-stop shop that's a little less overwhelming than clinicaltrials.gov, which is the large site, but we get all of the same trials that come through clinicaltrials.gov.